Have you ever thought about starting a podcast to support your education business? With global podcast listenership on the rise, low competition, and easier than ever technology, now is a great time to start podcasting to support your business. Hi, my name's Laura, and I help educators like you use media creatively to build strong connections and community to support your business. Today's work-along session is all about podcasting, and this is relevant to so many educational contexts. Perhaps you're a school owner and you want to start podcasting with your students and their families to showcase learning. This is a wonderful way to make learning visible and showcase what you do with the wider community. This can help obviously attract prospective students, and podcasting could become part of your unique offering. Or maybe you're an independent business owner who wants to record bilingual podcast content to support beginner level students. This can not only support your current students, but also make your classes and your offerings accessible again to prospective students. Or perhaps you're a teacher educator, and a podcast would be a wonderful way to showcase your expertise and skills to attract contracts, whether it's for speaking gigs or consultations or whatever your services are. Either way, the list is endless, and there's lots of ways in which podcasting can fit into your context. In this session, I'm going to walk through several points to inspire you to start podcasting. I'm going to start off by looking at what a podcast can look like so you can imagine it in your context. Next, I'm going to walk through the benefits that podcasting has to offer your business, as well as where to start, and some key questions that people often ask me about the technology and editing to overcome those barriers. For each of the points, I'm going to provide input and examples, and then I'll pause to ask you questions or set small tasks to get you thinking and taking action. For this session, you can just listen along and take notes using the summary sheet that you can download, or you can watch if you prefer. Let's move on to our first point on what a podcast can look like. When we think about podcasts, it's normal to think about the large media companies that publish every week or even daily as examples of this media. And this can feel pretty intimidating when we think about podcasting in our own context. Do we have to publish every week? Do we have to produce hour-long episodes? No, that's not the case. Podcasting is very unique to different contexts, and you don't have to compete with the large media companies in order to have something that's impactful and provides a return on investment for your business. For example, when I started podcasting 6 years ago, I started with the resources I had access to, which was a laptop. I bought a small microphone and I recorded in a cupboard to record the first season of T-Saw Pop. Now, this was just a standalone season of 10 episodes, and it was going to be just that. The evergreen nature of the content we recorded meant that it could stand alone as a project that would continue to serve teachers years and years on. And it did. It wasn't until much later that I considered rebooting the podcast to go weekly, which is where we are now. So this is the first thing to kind of think about, is that your podcast doesn't have to be a weekly installment. It could be a standalone season that maybe you record once a year or several times a year. You can think about what would serve you and what is also sustainable for you. In addition to the frequency of episodes, it's good to also think about who has access to the podcast. Again, when we think about podcasts, we refer to what's available in the public domain. But there's a whole world of podcasts that are hidden away behind subscription walls or on school learning management systems that we just simply don't see. For example, I know educators in business who offer podcast courses to their students as part of their course offerings. So students can listen along and then take classes, or they simply just purchase the podcast as a standalone subscription. This is an example of how your podcast doesn't necessarily need to be public, but it could be something that lives within your school or business ecosystem. So aside from frequency and the public versus private nature of the podcast media, another thing to think about is video versus audio only podcasts. Now, we're seeing a surge in video podcasts, but even myself, I do a video podcast now. The listenership of the audio-only version remains much, much higher than the video version that lives on YouTube. So for me, The video version of Teasel Pop that lives on YouTube is a great way to promote my podcast and to be discovered by the second largest search engine in the world. But when it comes to actual listener data, most people are preferring just to listen to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. I think this is really good to think about, because unless you're intending to do something that's very visually rich with a lot of different cuts and different angles to hold viewers' attention, your podcast will do perfectly well as audio only, and you can start with this as your model and see where it goes, with the potential of expanding to video options later down the line. A key thing to think about when you're envisioning your podcast is what's sustainable for you, particularly when you're thinking about the frequency of your episodes. If you can only do a season a year and that works for you, then that's something you can commit to and show up consistently for your listeners so they know when to expect from you. The key thing is to find your level and set a starting point, and you can always evolve and grow from there. Now is a great time to start podcasting, and there's several reasons for this. The first is that global podcast listenership is on the rise. By the end of 2024, it's expected that there'll be over 500 million global podcast listeners. And this is an exciting trend that we've seen over the past couple of years as podcasts become part of our day-to-day lives, from our coffee breaks to our commutes to work. Secondly, while there seems to be a lot of podcast shows out there, the competition is actually quite low. So according to Forbes, there's around 3 to 4 million podcast shows. And in fact, this number's perhaps a lot larger if we consider those hidden podcasts that aren't available to the public. Now, this can sound really intimidating, but don't be fooled by this statistic. In fact, not many of these podcasts are active. So according to Forbes, 44% of these have less than 3 episodes, and 18 to 24% have more than 10. What's more, only around 3 to 5% of these podcasts release a show every week. So really for you, this means finding what is sustainable, setting a consistent pace, whether that means you do a podcast series every year, and sticking to it and showing up for your listeners. A third reason why now is such a good time to start podcasting is the various ways in which we can monetize, whether it's working with a sponsor, affiliate marketing, listener support, or even just promoting our latest offers and courses. There's really a variety out there, and this is something that Holly Cope and I talked about recently. To learn more about these different options, check out my blog and the recording of our conversation. When it comes to sponsors or working with paid partners, as a small creator with an engaged audience, a very niche audience at that, I get to set the rate. So depending on what the sponsor's offering, how long they want me to mention their product, we can negotiate that. So instead of trying to compete with larger media production companies that have thousands of downloads and set their rate per 1,000 download, I set a fixed rate that feels good for me and good for my listeners. When I think about podcasting, I think about the old story of the hare and the tortoise. And I think when we think about content marketing, podcasting is the tortoise. It's the content that continues to work for you and bring you a return on investment. Whereas when I think about other social media platforms and the amount of content I have to create in order to stay present, that feels like the hare in the race that runs out of energy and essentially burns out. Now, this brings me to some of the benefits that podcasting has to offer. The first being that the content is evergreen. So for me, for episodes that I published years ago, they still continue to work for me and provide a return on investment and provide value to my listeners. When you're planning your content, try and tackle evergreen topics. So these could be common questions that you regularly get asked by your clients, or topics of learning that your students are always interested in, or annual festivals that your students are involved in. Things like this will continue to serve you long after they're published and continue to bring you a return on investment, whether that means bringing more students into your school or purchases of your course, or however the podcast lives in your business ecosystem. In addition to the evergreen nature of podcasts is the fact that you can repurpose this long form content into other chunks, whether it's audiograms, quotes, blogs, summaries to distribute on other social platforms or in your newsletter or on your website. This can save so much time because podcasting acts as the hero content that you can redistribute. So rather than creating lots of different content to remain present on platforms where you want to reach your audience, you can just simply repurpose your podcast and also draw more listeners to follow and subscribe to become part of your engaged listenership. A third benefit that podcasts have to offer is their reach. You can truly build a global audience of listeners and potentially draw in clients from different places where you may not have even visited. This has certainly been the case for me. Many of my clients who take the podcast Pathfinder course with me are in countries and places I've never visited, and I think that's such a wonderful way in order to reach markets and expand your business. A fourth benefit that podcasts have to offer is the way in which they enable you to build the know, like, trust factor, whether that's with prospective students, prospective contractors, whoever your business interacts with. Now, if you follow Daniel Priestley's work, he talks about 7 hours of quality time. This 7 hours that people need to spend with you in order to build that know, like, trust. And a podcast is a wonderful way to do that. People can tune in once a week or once a month, however frequently you're releasing episodes, to really get to know you. And this can be so much easier when you come to tell people about your latest offers and courses. You're more likely to have success selling to an already warm audience. This has certainly been the case for me. Clients I meet for discovery calls feel like they already know me, having listened to my podcast and my live book club sessions. This just makes the discovery calls so much more relaxed because they already know enough about what I do, they have familiarity with my work, my style, and so we're already starting with a really strong foundation when we talk about things like the podcast Pathfinder. A final benefit that I see podcasting has to offer is the fact that it doesn't demand us to be glued to our screens. I recently read a book by Celeste Headley about Do Nothing, where she mentions the addictive nature of our cell phones. And this really made me think about where I want to spend my time in content marketing and how I would like my listeners and prospective clients to engage with me. A podcast is a really wonderful way in which people can engage while doing something else. And in fact, when I ask my listeners what they're doing when they listen, they say that they're on a break, they say they're commuting to work, or even exercising, as one said, when they're listening to the podcast. I think this is a wonderful way that enables us to still remain connected, but not glued to our screens. And given the nature and the increased use of screens in our day-to-day lives, this can certainly be a strong selling point for your listeners. A key question here is, when you think about podcasting, what key benefits stand out for you and your business? Also, what benefits do you feel it will provide your audience? You've thought about some of the benefits, you know it's a great time to start podcasting, so how to start? The first thing is to think about your vision. How would a podcast fit into your business model? Now, based on the benefits I mentioned earlier, maybe this is a great way to nurture a community to tell them about your latest offers. Or maybe you're doing a lot of content marketing on various platforms and you want something more sustainable. And having a podcast that you can repurpose would be a great way to save time. Take some time to think about these benefits and your business model and how a podcast would fit into that ecosystem. Once you have your vision, the next thing to think about is your target audience. Now, this can be a bit scary because we want to get really intentional about who our audience is. The trick is not to try and please too many people, but just try and please one person. And I say that having made the mistake when I first started by trying to serve all the TESOL teachers instead of a specific profile. What I want you to think about is who your listeners are, what challenge they face, and how your podcast serves them. Now, this can be a bit difficult to think about just on our own, so maybe note down some ideas and speak to prospective listeners and people you trust to give valuable feedback, to bounce ideas and refine it. Once you have this template of who you're talking to, it'll be so much easier to plan your content, market your podcast, and think about how you talk to your listeners. You'll know exactly who you're talking to because you'll be able to visualize them as you record. Once you have a clear enough idea of who your podcast is for, your vision, and the message that you have, start creating. And don't be afraid if things evolve and change over time. Podcasting is a really creative process. And as you gain listener feedback and you look at the statistics, you'll gain a deeper understanding of who's listening and what they're listening for. And this will help guide future decisions. So for me, when I started, as I mentioned, I tried to serve too many people. But when I asked people who were listening to the podcast why they listened, what they were listening for, and their teaching context, I was able to build a much more clearer picture of who I was serving. And as a result, I was able to get a lot more intentional about my content. Once I did this, the listenership started to grow, engagement of listeners increased as well. So it can feel a bit counterintuitive actually to be so specific, but in fact, trust the process. It will help you gain more listeners and grow your podcast. So now over to you. Take a minute to note down, what purpose would your podcast serve? How does it fit into your bigger vision? Who is your target audience? What challenge do they face? And how does your podcast serve them? If you're ready to start podcasting to build stronger connections and build your community, then check out my Podcast Pathfinder program. This program is where I guide you in planning your first podcast mini-series and recording up to your first 3 episodes. I'll guide you through the whole process of creating your vision, knowing your audience, planning your episodes, as well as taking you through the podcast technology. To learn more about this program, go to my website, communicatingforimpact.com. In this final section, I'm going to cover a few key points to keep you moving as you start planning and thinking about recording your podcast. The first point is about what to podcast about. And if you're an educator, you may be tempted to create content that teaches a certain point to your learners, particularly if you're a language educator. I suggest not falling into the pitfall of teaching a lesson over a podcast, but instead doing something different that's unique to you. So for example, if your students or clients have difficulty in communicating in public in their workplace, perhaps your podcast could focus on public speaking strategies and skills for your language learners. Another example could be networking and helping your learners use storytelling to engage their audience and build those connections. This way you can provide value, you can mention your other courses without having to offer your lessons for free. The key point here is to think about what your ideal client needs and what makes you unique as an educator. By combining the two, you can create something really special and original. Another thing I get asked about a lot is about the podcasting technology, the technology we use to record and edit. So first things first, when you're thinking about recording content, think about where you're going to record. The space is really important in capturing high quality sound. So ideally, if you have a small, quiet room where you can record, where you can add soft furnishings such as cushions, rugs, curtains, books, for example, this is a great way to create a space that absorbs sound and prevents an echoey-like effect when you're recording. The next thing to think about is to evaluate what equipment you may already have access to, because perhaps you already have equipment that you could start to use to record. You don't need to have a microphone and setup like I have here. You may want to use a mobile device with a plug-in microphone that you use instead. The key thing is to do a little assessment of what you have, what you feel comfortable in using, and then see if there's any gap there, and then do some research to find what works for you. Tied in with the technology that we use to record is the technology that we use to edit. Now, fortunately, there's lots of free or very affordable editing software on the market now, and it's becoming a lot more user-friendly compared to how it was 6 years ago. So, for example, if you're a Mac user, you may want to use GarageBand, which comes installed with your Mac, or if you are a PC user, you can consider using Audacity, which is currently available for free for download. There's lots of others to choose from, and the key thing is when you start to think about editing is to think about your style. How much do you want to edit? Do you want to keep in the fillers and hesitations because it sounds more natural and relatable, or do you want to take those out? And that really does come down to a matter of preference and style. The second thing that you think about in tandem with that is what serves your listener. And this is where you need to be quite brutal in cutting out content where you feel it's not serving your listener, or maybe tailoring off to a side point that's not relevant. If you keep this in mind when you're editing, and you allow space while you're editing to come back to your episode and listen with fresh ears, it will really help you to make great editorial choices that will keep your listeners engaged. To reflect on this final point, do a little assessment of what technology you already have access to and what you may need in order to start podcasting. I hope this work-along session has inspired you to start podcasting to grow your community and your business. To learn more about podcasting, including the technology, content, and to gain ideas, consider signing up for my free newsletter where I offer tips and insights every week to inspire you to start recording. To do so, go to my website, communicatingforimpact.com, and sign up for the newsletter at the bottom of the page. Happy podcasting!